your belief and mine that this is what God is like. The other type of defeater is sometimes called an undermining defeater or undercutting defeater. Instead of attacking our belief directly, or instead of attacking the conclusion of some argument that we would give for the existence of God, an undermining defeater attacks the evidence that we offer in support of our belief. So, for example, if I offer an argument for the existence of God, a cosmological argument for the existence of God, somebody might attempt to produce an undermining defeater of my belief in God by arguing that my argument for the existence of God, my cosmological argument, just isn't a very good argument. It doesn't adequately support the conclusion that God exists. Now notice, with an undermining defeater, the opponent is not claiming that your belief is necessarily false. Your opponent is claiming that your belief is not adequately supported by the evidence that you propose. And so this is a claim about whether you're justified in believing that God exists on the basis of the evidence that you've presented. And if the undermining defeater is successful, and that indeed is the evidence that you have for believing that God exists, then this opponent will have succeeded in showing that your belief is not justified. It is not adequately grounded in the evidence. Now, the question before us would be, is the problem of evil one of these two types of defeaters? Is it a rebutting defeater, or is it an undermining defeater? If it functions as a rebutting defeater, then the problem of evil takes the form of an argument that God does not exist. Or it takes the form of an argument that belief in God is not justified, is not reasonable, is not rational. Now that's an important difference. And you get different formulations of the problem of evil depending upon which of those two beliefs you're attacking with your rebutting defeater from evil. What are those two beliefs again? One is God exists, and the other is it is reasonable to believe that God exists. These are two different claims. These are two different claims. It's one thing to believe that God exists. It's another thing to believe that it's reasonable to believe that God exists. Right? You could believe that God exists and for some reason believe that it's not especially reasonable to believe that God exists. Or you might believe that it is reasonable to believe that God exists and yet not believe that God exists. And clearly, your belief has a different object in each case. Here, the object of your belief is the existence of God. Here, the object of your belief is a belief. Now, the existence of God and a belief about the existence of God are not the same thing. So, the problem of evil may be offered as a rebutting defeater of either one of these two things. It may be offered as an argument that this claim that God exists is false, or it may be offered as an argument that this claim that belief in God is reasonable is false. Now, in the case where the defeater is acting in this second way against this conclusion, it has a relationship to an undermining defeater. It has a relationship to an undermining defeater. Because I might say, I believe that God exists. and here's the evidence that God exists. The opponent comes along and says, but I don't think your evidence is strong enough to overcome countervailing evidence, competing evidence, right, for the non-existence of God. And my opponent might say, now this evidence for the non-existence of God doesn't prove that God does not exist, but it does have to be part of the equation. So that when you offer positive evidence, it's got to be strong enough to overcome the negative evidence. If you set the negative evidence in one side of the balance, you set the positive evidence in the other side of the balance, which way do the scales tip? And it may be that they don't tip strongly for or against belief in God, and the best thing to do is to withhold belief. But evil has now functioned as evidence that weakens the strength of your evidence for believing that God exists. And in that sense, it might function as an undermining defeater. Now, these kinds of distinctions can be helpful because when you're talking to somebody who raises the problem of evil, a decision about how best to respond to that person can be facilitated by a decision about how the argument from evil is functioning for that opponent. What is it that the opponent is trying to accomplish? Is the opponent trying to show that God does not exist? Or is the opponent trying to show that it's unreasonable to believe that God exists? Or is the opponent trying to show that the evidence you presented, right, is either canceled or counterbalanced by evidence from evil, so that you need a stronger case than you've already presented to justify your belief that God exists? These are all possibilities. All right, so now we can look a little bit more intently at two popular formulations of the argument from evil. I've characterized it as the intuition, generally, that if God was morally perfect, all-powerful, and omniscient, then there wouldn't be evil. Because a morally perfect God would want to prevent evil, an all-powerful God could, and an omniscient being could anticipate it, see it coming before it happens, and prevent it. But now, let's get more precise. And let's distinguish two versions of the argument from evil, where the argument now is functioning as a kind of defeater. We'll ask the question of both formulations. Which type of defeater is it? Is it an undermining defeater or a rebutting defeater? The first formulation of the argument from evil is often called the deductive argument from evil. Sometimes it's called the logical argument from evil. And we'll use the term logical. The goal of the logical argument from evil is to demonstrate that believing that God is morally perfect, omnipotent, and omniscient is incompatible with believing in the reality of evil. You cannot consistently believe that God is morally perfect, omnipotent, and omniscient, and at the same time believe that there's evil in the world. This is the logical argument from evil. Now, for our purposes, let us simplify and just talk about whether it is consistent to believe three things together. God is morally perfect, God is omnipotent, and evil is a reality. Notice what we've left out, the omniscience of God. Now, I think we can do that in this case, partly because many atheists who like this form of the argument leave it out, and also because you could assimilate, if you're careful, you could assimilate the concept of divine omniscience to the concept of divine omnipotence, at least for the purposes of understanding the permission of evil.